Fireball Roberts is a NASCAR legend. He was a pioneer of the sport, a race winner, he's a Hall of Famer, and changed the sport in many ways. Unfortunately, Roberts' life was taken in a tragic fiery crash at the World 600. Today, we're going to look at his legacy and his tragic passing in some detail. But right before we get into it, over 100,000 of you all are returning to watch my videos every month, so if you find yourself coming back to my videos and you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a video. Anyway, let's get right into it. Roberts was born on January 20th, 1929, and grew up in Apopka, Florida. Apopka is located just north of Orlando, or about an hour southwest of Daytona Beach. During his early years, he became interested in auto racing and baseball. He was a pitcher for an American Legion baseball team called the Zellwood Mudhens, which is where his nickname Fireball comes from. They called him Fireball because of his fastball, and it just carried over to his time in racing. So much so that on Racing Reference, his name is listed as Fireball rather than his given name, Edward Glenn. If my name was Edward or Glenn, I would probably go by a nickname as well. Anyway, at the young age of 16, his family moved to Daytona Beach in 1945, and later that same year, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. However, he was just as quickly discharged after basic training because of his asthma. Asthma would be something that Fireball would keep on the down low throughout his career, and it would later contribute to his death. After the military didn't work out, Roberts attended the University of Florida to study mechanical engineering. Naturally, a young man who was interested in racing and who moved to Daytona Beach would gravitate towards actually racing. On the weekends, the helmet was on as he'd go racing on different local tracks in Florida and even the Carolinas. Roberts realized that this was his true passion, not baseball. Roberts would even sneak from home on the weekends to go racing. His parents were not big fans of him racing, probably due to the dangerous and expensive nature of the sport compared to his other passion in baseball. He started racing in NASCAR in 1950 at just 21 years old. Fittingly, he made his first start at Daytona Beach, where he completed only 8 laps and earned $25. It's very interesting that he started racing in NASCAR so young. The young guys back then were in their late 20s. Roberts was just a kid compared to these men. In only his third career start, he'd pick up his first win and take home $1,125 for his work. An even bigger payday was just a few weeks later in the Southern 500, where he'd finish second place and bring home $3,500. Despite only starting 9 of 19 races in his debut season, he'd finished second in the final standings, the closest he'd ever come to a championship. But for the next 5 years, he'd only attempt a handful of races each year, staying close to his home in Daytona Beach. At this time, he was racing mostly dirt modifieds. He didn't have to travel too far and the races paid well enough. But everything changed in 1956 when Roberts got an offer to drive for the factory Ford team, operated by Indy 500 winner Pete DiPaolo. Pete had a superstar lineup of drivers over the course of his short stint in NASCAR. Fireball Roberts, Buck Baker, Marvin Panch, Curtis Turner, Joe Weatherly, and Bill Amick. In Roberts' 2 seasons with the Ford factory team, he raced 75 times and amassed 13 wins. His career was looking up. He was racing more and winning more. He even won the Most Popular Driver Award in 1957 due to his cheerful personality. Remember, before these 2 years and 6 previous seasons, he only had 1 race victory in NASCAR's top division. But things seemed to take a turn for the worse whenever Ford announced they would stop funding racing activities at the end of 1957. This didn't stop Roberts. 1958 was a statement year for the driver, despite competing in only 10 of the 51 races. He won 6 of them with owner Frank Strickland. After this, things did take a turn for the worse for the popular driver. In 1959, he had jumped between rides with only 8 starts, 5 DNFs, and 1 win. In 1960, he'd start only 9 races, and failed to finish 7 of them due to crashes and mechanical problems. The only 2 races he finished, he won. This included a Daytona 500 qualifier race and the Dixie 300 at Atlanta. The next year in 1961 saw more consistency as he got a ride with owner Smokey Yunick, where he'd take home another win at Daytona and start 22 races. In 1962, he'd win his third straight Daytona qualifier race, but backed it up this time with a massive Daytona 500 win. In 1963, he'd start on the pole for the Daytona qualifier race and the Daytona 500, but unfortunately lose out in both races. He had finally found some stability racing for Holman Moody Racing, which was the same race team he had raced for when he won all kinds of races in 1956 and 57, just under new ownership. He was consistently a threat and went on to win 4 times in 1963. I know that was a lot of statistics, so I'm not going to bore you with any more. Mostly because this brings us to 1964. So we'll set the scene. By 1964, Roberts was an established guy. He had 32 wins, he finally had some stability in his career, and he had garnered almost $300,000 in race winnings. The New York Times reported, at the time, that he was the biggest career money winner in the history of NASCAR. He had one of some of the biggest races NASCAR had to offer, the Daytona 500, 2 Southern 500s, and 6 more times at the World Center of Racing. He hadn't won a championship, but that was due to running less than half of the schedule every year. Anytime he was on track, he was a contender. The man finished in the top 5 45% of the time. All of this, and he was only 35 years old. But there was one race he hadn't won before, the World 600 at Charlotte. Granted, it was a fairly new event, but it was still one of the biggest races of the entire series. Roberts only managed to qualify 11th for the 1964 event, but this wouldn't stop him from trying to win the big show. His efforts would be cut short quickly by an early vicious wreck. On lap 7, Ned Jarrett and Junior Johnson collided in front of Roberts. Roberts was trying to avoid the 2 drivers whenever he turned left and spun his own car out. He collided with an infield retaining wall, rear end first. The impact ruptured his fuel tank, his car flipped over, then burst into flames. Some witnesses claim that they heard Roberts scream, "Ned, help me," as he sat in his burning car. Ned rushed over to help and pulled him from the wreckage. Ultimately, he suffered 2nd and 3rd degree burns over 80% of his body and was airlifted to a nearby hospital. So let's stop just for a second. At the time, most drivers wore fire suits made of cotton, generally soaked in a flame-retardant chemical to combat fires. But Roberts was allergic to the flame-retardant chemicals, so he chose to wear an untreated cotton suit. His body had almost no protection from the heat, and in his burning car, he was literally burning in a furnace. Also, the whole asthma mixed with breathing in toxic fumes thing was not favorable for the Florida native. The first 48 hours after the crash were going to be the most crucial, and Roberts, he survived through it. The entire time he was near death. Reports suggest that he survived the initial wreck due to Ned pulling him from his car and telling him to hold his breath to not inhale the flames. And after the first 4 days of treatment, things started to look favorable. Even almost 5 weeks after the accident, he was still alive being treated for his injuries. That was until he developed pneumonia and blood poisoning. Within hours, Roberts went from stable condition to a coma, and a couple of days later, Roberts was gone. He was only 35 years old. Family, friends, and fans mourned the loss of Fireball Roberts, arguably the most successful and fastest driver at his time. He was called a pathfinder of the superspeedway era. By some reports, he was dubbed stock car racing's first superstar. Fireball Roberts had a 13-year-old daughter at the time of this wreck. Even to this day, she has never returned to Charlotte Motor Speedway. Roberts also lost his close friend Joe Weatherly in an accident just months before this. Following Roberts' death, driver Ned Jarrett, who was involved in the accident, would go on to state that his retirement decision was prompted by Roberts' death. Just like other drivers' fates played a role in developing safety for the sport, Roberts' accident led to NASCAR developing and mandating fire-retardant suits and safer fuel cells. Another tragic piece to the story is the fact that there were some sources reporting that Roberts was going to retire soon after the World 600. One source states, he had taken a prominent public relations position at a brewing company, and that the race in which he was killed was to be one of the final races of his career. So let's remember Roberts a little bit. First off, how poetic is it that Roberts won at the World Center of Racing, his home track in Daytona, 7 times, including the Daytona 500. He also set 4 different speed records at the track. The number 11 1939 Ford Coupe that Roberts drove at many Central Florida tracks in his early years was dubbed the White Lightning because of its speed on a weekly basis. Smokey Yunick used this famous basketball trick when Roberts was behind the wheel. This trick involved putting a basketball in the gas tank, so when the car went through inspection, the fuel tank would take in the right amount of gasoline, but the team would deflate the basketball for the race, allowing more fuel. During one race, Joe Epton, the chief scorer, kept asking Roberts' wife, how hasn't he pitted yet? She just shrugged her shoulders and kept taking sips of coffee. Luckily, caution flags during this specific race would fall at perfect times, to where it wasn't as suspicious and it wasn't discovered by NASCAR. Roberts was smart too. He may have revolutionized the sport entirely. Journalist Max Muehlman, who covered much of Roberts' career and became a friend of his, stated Roberts was one of the first guys, maybe the first, to become a big winner by using brains and discipline, as well as bravery and extra skill levels. When asphalt tracks arrived, Fireball recognized the technique was different and adapted to it in a very thoughtful and calculated way, as well as using the skills that take you far in dirt track racing. He went on to state that he was the Mickey Mantle of auto racing. Roberts was a dirt expert, but he'd go on to be one of the best asphalt drivers in the sport. So I want to end with this quote from Max, who, upon hearing the news of Roberts' death, simply wrote, "It was like awakening to find a mountain, but then suddenly it was gone." Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope you did enjoy. If you have some stories or anything you want to say about Fireball Roberts, let me know down in the comments down below. He seemed like just a class act and a really good guy. And upon doing my research, he left a lot bigger legacy and had more of an impact than I ever thought. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed. Leave a like if you did. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.